Thanks for coming to this talk. There is Martin Mikos speaking two doors to the left. He's way more interesting than I am. So I would be there if I had not to talk. My goal is to make it slightly, so there are four tracks. So my goal is to make this presentation slightly more entertaining than the legal track. And so that sets the bar. My name is Fabrizio Capobianco. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I'm the president of Funambl. I don't know if you ever heard of Funambl. It's an open source project that was started in 2001. Became a company called Funambl in 2003. Raised $35 million in the last 10 years. And our aim from the beginning was to build what you call today iCloud. Something that will work across devices, something that will sell to consumers. And so we have millions of users using it. It's probably become one of the largest open source projects in mobile. Definitely was one of the first. And what we do is allow you to take a picture or change your phone number or change your an event in your address book and then synchronize it across devices. So you might take a picture on your Android, it gets on your iPad, it gets on your BlackBerry, on Symbian, on your TV, on your car. That's our market. And we sell to mobile operators and device manufacturers. So our customers go from carriers in the US like Sprint or British Telecom, Deutsche Telekom, or companies, device manufacturers like LG, Samsung, Palm, and so on. I was asked to do a talk about the future of mobile open source. So thinking about the future is difficult. So I thought I'm going to go easy and I start with the past. That I know fairly well. So I decided to go and kind of tell myself a story of what happened in the last 10 years. And so the presentation will go from the left, from what is past. And when I started working on this, it's more a story of what I've done in the last 10 years. Then the present, where we are in open source, where we are in mobile open source in particular. And then just a quick look at the future. So if I look at the past 10 years, first thing that really happened in open source is probably around 2001. 2001 is when Sync4j started. Sync4j is the project that was behind Funambl. And the idea was that we would build a synchronization product to synchronize devices to a server, which today you could call the cloud. At the same time, and this is a guy in Italy that is my co-founder that started working on Sync4j in 2001. At the same time, another Italian guy, for reasons that I don't understand, started working on another open source project called Wurfel. Don't know if you ever heard of it. How many people have heard of Wurfel? Okay. Not a heavy mobile cloud. So Wurfel is an open source project that now has become a company as well called Scienza Mobile. Took 10 years to become a company. And the idea is that they realized exactly what we realized. And it was that we had billions of devices in front of us. And we were three people in a canteen in Italy, and we thought we will never ever be able to make our client work on 2 billion phones. Or 3 billion, 5 billion, if it gets on TVs, on fridges and microwaves. How do we solve this problem? And other companies in the space have tried to solve the problem, hiring people. And you have to port the client from this device to that device to that device. You keep hiring people. And the problem with mobile is that not only the devices are different, they're different because there is localization. So the same phone in French or in Chinese or in English is different. And localization makes a difference also on where you're testing the device. Because if you are testing it with one carrier in India or another carrier in Italy or in the US, the behavior of the phone is different. So we looked at this problem and we just concluded that there was absolutely no chance for us to make it because we didn't have the money. And so we thought, let's do it with the open source. Let's see if we can create a community that will actually do the work with us. That a guy in India that particular phone can build a client for it. And Wurfel was exactly the same thing. Their idea is that every phone will have different screen sizes, different characteristics. How do we know the characteristic of a phone that hits our website. And so he started working on building a file that is the Wordful file, where every phone on the planet is described with the screen size and the characteristic of the phone, so that you can serve a page that phone today. It's something that is used by Google, Facebook. Everyone uses this project. Back then, I was using a Nokia phone, and I was using a Palm Pilot. And that's the extension of mobility back then. The question of why using open source is something I put in my blog. I have a blog called Mobile Open Source that I started in 2006. It's been 6 years. Back then, Martin was the CEO of MySQL. Now he's 2 doors down. And so he will always tell you that the reason why open source wins is quality. Is the fact that you have a lot of people in different locations that are testing your product and then helping your product become stable and actually work. And so the difference between bad software and good software has always been what open source aimed for. And testing is everything in mobile is just probably a clue why we thought open source will apply to mobile better than any market we've ever seen. Because mobile is complexity, and where there's complexity and there are a lot of devices, that's where open source thrives. My experience, I was lucky because when I was in Italy during my PhD, I was in the lab where one of the person in the lab was writing the device driver for Linux, for the mouse. His name is Alessandro Rubini, and he was working to have something move on the screen for the first time. Instead of just text. And I saw how he was doing that with a community of people around the world, and I thought, well, there are enough mice out there, but if you look at mobility and mobile devices, this can actually play out in the long run. So that was 2001. In 2003, a couple of companies were formed. One is Funambul, which is the one I did, and the other one is Android. Android was a company by Andy Rubin. He started in the U.S. He ran out of money fairly quickly, so that somebody actually had to lend him $10,000 to just keep going. So I think this is where probably the first 2 companies were created. One of the 2 guys became rich and famous. The other one is actually speaking right now. And he got acquired by Google. That's, I think, the main difference. That was the phone I used. 2003, I actually moved in the Valley in 99 and then went back in 2002 to Italy for a year to set up the development center, and I came back. That phone was the first phone that allowed me to run an application on it. It was a Java ME app, and I was super excited about it. In 2004, I started fundraising. So I went around the Valley trying to sell the concept of open source. And at the beginning of 2004, everybody was telling me, you're crazy. I mean, there is no intellectual property in open source. Nobody's going to give you money. So I kind of was open source, like put it back. And then I said, oh, we have a mobile application server. And it wasn't that easy to sell as a mobile application server. In 2004, at the end of 2004, I went to an SD forum event, and I had a table, sort of like this one, but a lot smaller. Kim Polese was actually giving a talk that day, and I started getting 1 VC, 2 VC, 3 VCs. They all come and talk to me, and I asked one of them, I said, why are you talking to me? And he said, well, because open source is red hot. And I was like, well, I didn't get the memo 6 months ago. Nobody wanted open source because the intellectual property, forget the intellectual property. There are VCs in the Valley, they're all investing on anything open source. It could be ERP, CRM, anything. And so all of a sudden, my company became mobile open source. I just changed mobile, my application server, took open source, became, we're the open source of mobile. And with Andrew Aitken, we kind of went around trying to talk people about open source in mobile, and he came up with the word inevitable. I mean, it's not there, but it's clear that mobile is going to be the largest market possible, and open source, if it's working on this first markets, like databases, operating system, will get there in mobile. So in In 3 weeks, I got a first term sheet, and it was $3 million valuation. And over a dinner became $8 million. That tells you how the VC operate. And the wine was very good. And then eventually we raised the first $5 million. But at that point, open source was it. It was the reason for investing. And so I invested quite a bit in the open source. And 2004 went like that. 2005, we actually finally raised money. That's the year where Android got bought by Google. So it's 2005 that it all started. I don't know if Andy had an idea of using open source, going open source or not, but that was when Google made the first move towards mobility and gave the idea that they will do something in mobile. That's also the years when Maemo came out, and there is a story of unsuccessful operating systems in open source, unfortunately, and Maemo is the first of them. And came out from Nokia and seemed to be the Linux of a mobile. And that was the idea, is trying to put a lot of effort into one operating system. The other thing I did in 2005, which is kind of funny if I look back, is that I filed a trademark for mobile open source. So I can always say that I tried to trademark mobile open source. And unfortunately, my lawyers, once I hired them, said that I was crazy, that there was no chance to have a trademark on mobile open source because it was too generic. So I quickly backtracked. But I can always say that on March 8, before raising money, I did try a trademark open source in mobile. I was convinced, as you can imagine, that this was going to be a big thing. So the year later, I did another stupid thing, which is I didn't like the license we were using for the open source project. These were the fun, interesting days of open source, where we were all discussing about licenses and bitching, and Mark Fleury and Jay Boss were doing astroturfing, posting as other people on blogs, saying things bad about the competition, and it was fun. It was a time where we really had fun. One of the things we did with Funambul was we had BSD as a license when we started. And then 2 years later, when I started Funambul as a company, I wanted to have a company. I needed a paycheck from day one. So I'm not a religious open source person. I thought that the paycheck will be important. I like open source. I like openness. And I like freedom. But I do need to eat. And we shifted to GPL, also because one of our competitors just took our code and then went around saying they were the professional version of Funambul. And we were kids in a canteen and they will actually provide the service. So we decided, okay, let's at least give us back some code. And we changed to GPL. We never seen them. They went public and it was a fairly successful company. The thing that bothered me, though, even with GPL, was that companies like Google could take our software and just put it behind the firewall and claim they were not distributing the code. What it was known as the ASP loophole, and the fact that GPL will trigger when you distribute the software. So if you don't distribute but use it behind a firewall, and cloud will be today, then you don't have to distribute. And that's how Google was built. And I just didn't like it, and I decided, since everybody was doing, to create my own open source license called HPL. It was the honest public license, and it just was GPL that said simply, if you run this as a service, you're distributing the software anyway. Therefore, you need to give the code back to the community. And you can make money, do whatever you want, but we want to see the code. You can't run away with that. I remember I wrote a post talking about Sugar CRM. Because they had a model which was more, not honest, or less honest as I wanted. And then John called me. I was I was moving, and my computer was packed in a box. All of a sudden, I got a call, and he's yelling at me, saying, "You're calling me dishonest?" I said, "Oh shit, no, I'm not." So I went and I unpacked my laptop, and I changed that line to explain that wasn't the case. OpenMoko came out that year. OpenMoko was the first open source hardware project. They wanted to open source the full phone. from the device, the source code, the design, and it was a great initiative, and didn't get very far, but was pretty big. In November, Sun was big. Java was the language of mobile. If you ever try to build an app for a mobile phone, it would be in Java. The problem is that you will build an app for a mobile phone, one, and then for the second mobile phone, you'll have to rewrite it, and for the third one, you will have to rewrite it again. So didn't really live up to the right ones and run anywhere. And so didn't make it. And they went open source everything. That was probably the first signal that I got that open source was going to make it in mobile. Because if Sun decided to get into this, and it was because of mobile, because of other things, it meant that we were going to somewhere. The year that everything changed is 2007. 2007 is the year the world changed, my world changed, and is when the iPhone was announced. That was January, nothing to do with open source, but you will always look at mobile as pre-iPhone and post-iPhone. Pre-iPhone, there was no application, there were no consumers, there was no smartphones. When iPhone came out, I did write the line on my blog that at the beginning I wasn't too thrilled, but I kind of got convinced that the June 29th of 2007 will be the turning point. So I wrote this line, and I was convinced that something was going to change. And what happened that year is everything. We had WebKit being open sourced by Apple. We had GPL v3 come out. We had Moblin, which was an Intel open source operating system, to be pushed. And most of all, the OHA, the Open Handset Alliance, was built by Google. And Google actually said, we're going to release Android as open source. And that is the turning point. So 2007 is just the year where I think everything happened. And a lot of people, I mean, I've had friends in Nokia that said, well, this phone, Apple will never be able to make a phone that people will actually use. And they might still, some of them might still be convinced about it, but I think they were proven wrong. The year after 2008 is the year where AGPL v3 came out, which was GPL plus the honest piece of my license. So we decided we embraced AGPL, we submitted to OSI, got approved as an open source license, we switched to it, and that was the last time I ever talked about licensing and licenses in open source. If you are starting a project today and it's a cloud project and you want someone to give you the code back, AGPL is the license you should choose. The same year we had the first Android phone. It was called G1, where the G stands for garage door opener. So it was a beautiful device with two buttons. As soon as I put it in, I put it in front of my wife. She said, "So is that to open the garage?" I said, "No, it's supposed to be a phone." I said, "Oh, okay, that's interesting." And what I find crazy about Google Android and open source is that I got back to the development center, I think it was 2007, 2008. And I got everyone in that office, where we had 40, 45 developers, asking me, when are we going to build an Android client? And I'm like, there's no phone. Why do we have to build an Android client? Oh, it's cool. We got to build an Android client. And so that is what changed everything, is that the iPhone was out there and the geeks wanted to build an Android client. They didn't want to build a Maemo client or a Symbian client or a Moblin client. They wanted to build an Android client because Google was behind it, because great phones will come out of it. And I still today, I don't understand, beside open source and Google as a brand, it's hard for me to understand why they came out with an operating system and everyone in the world started writing applications. You try to do that with WebOS, Palm, better operating system, even Windows Phone today. You just can't have people develop for it. Everyone I knew wanted to build an Android client. Without phone, with that garage door opener, they wanted to get one of those and they want to write an application that will work on it. Which is sort of insane. If you look back, it's just the timing was perfect and they just did it. Symbian got open source that year. So at that point, I knew we were onto something, because Symbian was 75% of the market back then. And they said, we will open source everything. And Android was open source. And then we had this closed environment of iOS and Apple that it was them against open source. 2009, nothing really happened. I don't know why. 2010 is the year where Migo came out. So the Moblin on one side and Maemo on the other side. You have two drunk, you just get them together, and usually good things happen. So Migo happened with Nokia and Intel behind. So I thought with the power of Intel and the look and the ability to design phones by Nokia, this could actually make it. But then Android was growing. The iPod came out, which was is just another game changer, and it's still a game changer in mobile. Then we go to 2011. 2011 is when, well, actually, Nokia said, well, we're not doing Migo anymore. And we thought about Android, but we want to be more unique, and so we're going to go Windows Phone. And so they abandoned, So they abandoned Migo. At that point, this other operating system came out, Tizen, I guess. WebOS, at the end of the year, HP, I wrote a post 2 years before saying, once HP bought Palm, I say just open source it right away, try to get developers, get into the game, and maybe you're going to have apps, maybe you can make it. And eventually, at the end of last year, they decided open source WebOS, which is kind of a trendy thing. When you don't know what to do with code, you just throw in open source. It's your open source trash can. It's where good software comes to die. And WebOS is a phenomenal software. We had under some NDAs, but I mean we were powering the engine for it on the synchronization. So I've been into that. It's probably the best operating system I've seen. They were so ahead of everybody else, but they just didn't get enough developers. And the issue right now is that you have phones, and then you have developers, and you have users. In order to have users, you need to have applications. In order to have application, you need to have the developers who write them. But the developers only write application where there are users. And so that's where the circle, that nobody has been able to just come up with a good idea on how do I start a new operating system, how do I get a lot of users to use it so that developers will build the apps, or better, as they're trying to do today, users will come, let me get developers. And so what Windows Phone does, what other operating systems do, they pay developers to build apps. Port the top 30, top 40, top 50, top 100. You're just still not there. You don't get enough developers, you don't get enough apps, and don't get enough users. And maybe Nokia and Windows Phone can actually break this. The other thing that really happened that I think is the ultimate success of open source is the Kindle Fire. The Kindle Fire is a fork of Android. And when people talk about open source and what open source can do to you and why open source can bring innovation, I always point to the Kindle Fire. Kindle Fire is today the largest tablet in market share in Android. So went from 0 to 50+%. It is a fork. So there was source code. It was open. It was up there. A large company like Amazon took it and innovated on it. And if people say, oh, Android is not open source enough, it might be true. It's not that open source. But it's an open source enough that the source code is there. You can take it and fork it and build a phone that beats anyone in the competition that is going with Google. So I think that's a demonstration why open source makes innovation. And if you look at, that was the past. If you look at the present, I think one graph is really the one that tells me everything. Is the smartphone OS market, and it's a Pac-Man. Open source is 65%, proprietary is 35%. It's just complete domination. Android went from 36% in Q1 2011 to 56%. These are Gartner numbers from this month. Symbian is still at 8.6, iOS at 22, and BlackBerry 6.9. I'm expecting BlackBerry to be at single digit, actually it's 0 point sooner or later. Others, Windows Phone maybe. Symbian will disappear. I think Android and iOS will share the cake, but I think the cake will be 80% open source and 20% not. And that is, if you do the same cake for the PC world, you'll see that Windows has still 89% of the market, and non-Windows is 11%. So, and open source there in Linux is, because the Mac is there, is probably 1 or 2%. Maybe on the server we still have a chance. On mobile, we won. There's just no other way to put it. The growth of Android is just so fast that I think can't be stopped. So that's where mobile open source today is, in my opinion. It's just past being something that's emerging to a point where it's just domination. The other one is another example I can give you. This is less mobile, but it's also going to be really mobile. Is web browser usage. Internet Explorer is 34%. Chrome has WebKit as an engine. Firefox is open source. Safari has WebKit as an engine. So if you put together everything else, you go again to another Pac-Man. And I'm pretty sure that this is not going to change much. You're going to have Safari growing because it's iOS and it's on smartphones and tablet as well. You're going to have Chrome grow because it's on Android and that's tablet as well. And I don't know about Firefox. I'm not too bullish on it, but even here, I think open source and mobile in particular will be dominating. One thing that everybody says is that, yes, nice, but what about fragmentation? So I'll keep the title here is something that came from a friend of mine, Sean Pultz, which was the CEO of OpenMongo, who said that fragmentation is innovation. So you shouldn't look at fragmentation as a negative thing. In reality, when you look at the amount of Android devices out there, it's pretty scary. That's almost 4,000 counted different Android phones. So there's got to be some fragmentation. This is the amount of brands that are behind these 4,000 devices. And again, you just have, I think you can see this in two ways. One is, oh man, I'm better off with Apple iOS, which is one device, one company, and they're not going to change it much. Or you can look at it and say, well, look at what open source does. Look how many companies are making money, or at least are investing in an open source operating system. And it's just an enormous amount. And at the end of the day, if you look at Android, yes, there is fragmentation. It is true. But if you put together 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.3.3, you get to 90%. So this is a graph. This is just, I took it yesterday out of the Google site. This is how fragmented Android is. And there is a little bit of Android 3, there is a little bit of Android 4. It's going to explode, and probably you're going to get another Pac-Man on the other side in a year or so. You're going to have 90% being Android 4. But we build apps for Java ME phones. We build apps for Symbian phones. It is true, iOS, because it's controlled, there is one lord of everything, doesn't change much. And it's a lot easier for a developer. But Android is not as bad as Apple will try to tell you. And when you talk about fragmentation, and fragmentation will be innovation, again, this is the table that I would like to pick out, which is market share of Android tablets in February. And that tells you that the Kingdom went from 0 in October to 54% in February, and now is dominating the tablet market on Android. And this is fragmentation. They fragmented Android. They built a new operating system, and they innovated on it. And they are coming out with a new device. They're coming out with more devices. Android is going to split. And they will do everything they can to allow you to port your app to their Android and the other Android, because they have an interest in allowing people to build apps. But the reality is that this happened because of fragmentation, and innovation that maybe was not coming from Google is now coming from Amazon. And you just see that this is going to go twice as fast as it could go because Amazon doesn't have to wait for the other 25 handset manufacturers. They can just go fast. So they'll be fast, and they will publish their code back so that Google can take some of it and put it back in Android. And that is the value of open source. That's why open source wins. And that wins, I think, won in mobile. So my talk was supposed to be on future. And I thought about future quite a bit. And I kind of came to the conclusion that, well, we don't really need a future. I think that's an easy answer for future of open source. We need a present. I mean, there's nothing more that we can do beside world domination. We can dominate a little bit more and get 83% instead of 72%. But the reality is that open source in mobile has won on the operating system, has won on the browser system, so consumer's application and not consumer application. At this point, I think the future is just like the present. I don't see any chance for proprietary vendors to take majority. I see that open source in mobile will just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're going to have more Android. We're going to have more browser with open source engines. We're going to have more open source products. It is the first market where, because it started later and open source came, we just got in and just took the entire market. And so to me, the future is, if you want boring, it's like an open source conference. And which I said 2 years ago, I said open source conferences are boring. I'm never going to go to an open source conference. What I saw 4 years ago was that it was fun to go to Mobile World Congress, to every conference which was not open source, to talk about open source because it was something that was new. And it was fun to talk about open source in a blog because it was something that was new. But at a certain point, open source in mobile has become mainstream. If I went through my blog post and I saw the last 4 years, I really didn't have anything interesting to say. It's just that it is there and it's there to stay. So that's pretty much the future. The future of open source in mobile is open source. I got convinced that I got nothing else to say about mobile open source, so that I decided to close my blog as of today. It's been 6 years of mobile open source blog, and it's been a lot of fun, but it's just not, at this point, it's just so into everything that, they say that when you want to quit when you are on top. And I think at this point, since we won, I better get off of the mobile open source bandwagon. And that's my talk. Thanks.